Story number 1. The strange encounters on Everest's winter peak. I've never been afraid of heights. Hell, I've been a mountaineer for over a decade, scaling peaks that would make most people quake in their boots. But there are some places that have a way of getting into your soul, of testing the limits of what you can bear, both physically and mentally. Mount Everest in the winter is one of those places. I'll never forget the night we camped on that mountain. It was the last night any of us would ever feel truly safe. It all started innocently enough, at least at first. We were a small group, 6 of us, seasoned climbers with years of experience in harsh conditions. But Everest in winter, especially the South Col route, is a different beast entirely. The winds howl like some ancient creature calling from the void, and the cold seeps into your bones until you wonder if you'll ever be warm again. We were on the final stretch, the summit just out of reach, and it had taken us longer than we expected. The weather had turned bad: blizzards, snow squalls, the kind of thing you read about in books but can never really understand until you're trapped in it. It wasn't the first time we'd encountered bad weather, but this felt different. This felt wrong. We were camped at around 22,000 feet when we saw it. A small group of tents, tucked away behind a rocky outcrop. At first, we thought it was another expedition, maybe a team that had gone ahead of us. But when we approached, something didn't sit right. The tents looked abandoned, their flaps barely holding up against the wind. The snow around them had been disturbed, but not in the usual way. It was as though someone had been there recently, but there was no fresh trace of life, no footprints leading away, just a vast, empty silence. "We should check it out," I suggested, though even as the words left my mouth, I felt a strange hesitation. It's always a bad idea to approach abandoned camps, especially at this altitude, but curiosity, or maybe some deeper instinct, pushed us forward. We stepped into the first tent, our boots crunching against the frozen snow. Inside, everything was left in a hurry: sleeping bags, food supplies, even a half-filled water bottle. All of it was perfectly untouched, just like the crew had up and vanished in an instant. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, no wreckage that might indicate something terrible had happened. It was just empty. "Where are they?" One of my teammates asked. His voice had a nervous edge to it, and I could hear the tension in the way he breathed. "This doesn't make sense." None of us said anything, but we all felt it, that nagging sensation creeping at the back of our minds, the feeling that we weren't alone, that someone or something was out there, watching us. I was the first to step back outside. The wind hit me like a slap to the face, but it didn't push me away. I was compelled, as if something was pulling me deeper into the scene, into that empty campsite. I stepped closer to the second tent. That's when I saw it. A small object, lying in the snow just a few feet away from the entrance. It was a black mitten, its fabric caked with frost, half buried under the snow. It was odd, so wrong. It didn't belong here. It was out of place. It wasn't just any mitten. It was the kind of mitten someone would wear if they had been caught off guard, if they had left in a hurry. I picked it up, and that's when the temperature around me seemed to drop even further. It wasn't just the cold. There was something else, something darker. My breath came out in misty clouds, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I felt eyes on me. It wasn't just the cold that sent a shiver down my spine. It was as if something in the air was watching me, waiting for me to make the wrong move. "Hey, guys, we need to go," I said. My voice strained. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the adrenaline coursing through me. But when I turned back to the others, I saw the fear mirrored in their eyes. They had noticed it too, that same feeling. We all felt it, as if the mountain itself was alive and breathing around us, ready to swallow us whole. It was then that we heard it. A distant sound, a low groan carried on the wind. At first, we thought it was just the wind, but the more we listened, the clearer it became. It wasn't the wind. It was a voice, a soft, distant voice that seemed to come from all around us. It was too faint to make out, but it was there, undeniably there. I don't know why we stayed as long as we did. Maybe it was fear, maybe it was curiosity, or the stubbornness of mountaineers to never turn back. But something kept us tethered to that spot. Even as the night deepened and the wind began to howl louder, we couldn't leave. The tents started to shift in the wind, not the way they normally would, bending under the pressure of the storm, but moving as if they had a life of their own. Flaps fluttered open and closed, the fabric rustling like whispers. It was like the tents were waiting. "Let's go now," Mike said, his voice barely above a whisper. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a kind of primal fear. I don't know if I had ever seen anyone look so scared in my life. But when we turned to leave, we found that the path back to our own tents had disappeared. The snow had shifted so dramatically that it was impossible to tell where we had come from. The groan came again, louder this time, and then a voice, unmistakable, close and clear. "Stay." It was soft but insistent, like a warning, a demand. We were trapped. The mountain had taken us. And that's when I realized those missing climbers, they hadn't disappeared. They had become part of the mountain. The cold, the darkness, the voices, they were all part of a story that had no end. We were just the latest players in a game that had been going on for centuries. We stayed that night, huddled together in the center of the abandoned camp. The wind screamed, and the voices, those voices, grew louder, swirling around us. I could feel them, brushing against my skin like cold fingers. And then, in the early hours of the morning, just before the storm broke, the tents fell silent. We left the next day, the storm having suddenly stopped, as if it had never been. The camp was just as we had left it, empty. The voices had vanished. But the chill, that suffocating, creeping chill, it stayed with us. We never spoke of it again. Not to anyone. I don't know why. Maybe because we knew no one would believe us. But every time I think back on that night, I can still hear it in the wind, the soft whisper of the mountain, the voice that told us to stay, the voice of the lost. And the thing is, I'm sure we weren't the last ones to hear it. Story number 2. The strange Christmas night drive. I'll never forget that night. It's been years, but the memory of it still haunts me, especially around Christmas. I wasn't looking for adventure. Not that night. Hell, who wants a Christmas adventure when you're a long-haul trucker, driving through the snow in the middle of nowhere? But there are some things you just can't unsee, no matter how hard you try to forget. I'd been on the road for hours, the weight of the night sinking in. It was Christmas Eve, the kind of night where the air is thick with snow, and the world outside your cab feels like it's fading away. The radio had long since given up, only static in its place. So I had nothing but the hum of the engine and the snow slapping against the windshield for company. The route I was on was remote. Most drivers took the highway that skirted the town, the one that kept you close to civilization. But not me. I'd made a habit of taking the back roads, the narrow, winding paths that no one else bothered with. There was something comforting about the isolation. No cars, no noise, just me and the road. It was a kind of peace, I suppose. But that night, the peace was shattered. The storm hit out of nowhere. 1 minute, it was just light flurries, the kind that brush against your skin and make you squint a little. The next, it was like the sky had opened up and unleashed everything it had. Snow poured down in sheets, thick and heavy, reducing visibility to nothing. I could barely see more than a few feet in front of the truck. The wind was fierce, howling like it had a vendetta. I slowed down. Of course, you don't take chances in weather like that. But even at a crawl, the road was treacherous, the tires fighting for grip on the slick surface. I could feel the truck slipping a little as it made its way through the winding forest. That's when I started to feel it, the feeling. It's hard to explain, but you know it when you feel it. That sensation that someone is watching you. The kind of feeling you get when you're walking through a dark alley, and you know something's not right, but you can't quite put your finger on it. I shook it off at first, telling myself it was just the storm playing tricks on my mind. The wind had a way of making strange sounds, and the way the snow flurries danced across the windshield could mess with your vision. But then, it happened again. This time, it wasn't just a feeling. I saw it. A shadow. A movement. Just out of the corner of my eye. I glanced to the side, my heart skipping a beat. Nothing. I forced myself to breathe, my hands tightening on the wheel. Maybe it was just the trees, swaying in the wind, creating illusions. But then there it was again, another shadow. It was fast. Too fast. And it moved. I'm not a superstitious guy, but something about that moment made my blood run cold. I could feel my pulse quicken, my palms sweating despite the cold air in the cab. I tried to tell myself it was just the storm again, playing tricks on me. But then, the knocking started. First, it was soft, almost like a tap, as though someone was gently tapping on the window. I froze, my eyes wide as I stared straight ahead. It wasn't the wind. The wind was howling in the trees. But this was different. This was deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. I slowly turned my head toward the window. The snow was coming down so thick that I could barely see outside. But I could have sworn I saw something moving. Something in the shadows just beyond the edge of the glass. A figure? No, couldn't be. I was alone, right? The tap came again, louder this time, and it was followed by a faint scraping sound, as if something was running its fingers along the side of the truck. My heart slammed against my chest. Couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream, to jump out of the truck and run. But I couldn't. Something in me told me that if I opened that door, if I looked outside, I would see something that would change everything. I didn't. I stayed frozen, my hands clutching the steering wheel so tight I thought I might snap it in half. The knock came once more, but this time, it was followed by something worse. A voice, soft, barely audible over the howl of the wind, but unmistakable. Let me in. My blood ran cold. I didn't answer. Couldn't. My mind was racing, my heart pounding. I was shaking so violently that I had to force myself to focus. There was nothing out there. It was just the storm. Just the storm. I repeated it to myself like a prayer. The knock came again. This time, couldn't hold it back. I had to look. My body moved before my brain could process the decision. Slowly, I turned my head, peering out the window, the fog of my breath fogging up the glass. And that's when I saw it. A figure, barely a shadow, standing just outside the truck. It wasn't a person. Not really. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and the way it stood so still, like it was part of the storm itself, made my stomach twist. I couldn't make out its face, but I knew it was looking at me. Let me in. The voice came again, clearer this time, as though it was coming from inside the cab. I could feel its breath on my neck, the cold air seeping through the window as if the figure was right there, just beyond the glass. But when I turned my head back, there was nothing. No figure, no shadow, no sign that anyone had been there at all. I slammed my foot on the gas, and the truck lurched forward, faster than I'd ever driven through that storm. The headlights cut through the snow in a frantic frenzy. But I didn't dare look back. Couldn't. I knew, deep down, that whatever had been out there was still following me, watching me, waiting for me to make the wrong move. I never went back that way, never took that road again. The memories of that night linger like a shadow, always there, always just out of reach. Every Christmas, I think about it. Every Christmas, I hear that voice in the back of my mind, cold and distant, calling out to me, let me in. Story number 3. The Vanishing Village of Siberia. I've been to places in the world where the snow doesn't just fall, it devours. I've been to Siberia, the heart of the coldest, most unforgiving landscape on Earth. But even in a place as bleak and inhospitable as Siberia, nothing prepared me for the story I'm about to tell you. It's a story of a village that disappeared, leaving behind nothing but frozen houses and strange footprints leading into the forest. Footprints that never returned. They say the dead tell no tales. But the dead in Siberia, well, they left one. I was part of the rescue team that was sent out after the blizzards hit. But there's something they don't tell you about those missions. Sometimes, what you find out there in the wilderness doesn't make sense. It doesn't just break your heart. It breaks your mind. The village we were supposed to save was called Yalovka. Small, remote, tucked into a valley surrounded by ancient pines that seemed to stretch to the sky. It wasn't much, just a handful of families trying to scrape out a living in one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. It's not like anyone could really get out. When winter came to Siberia, swallowed you whole. There were no roads, no easy escape. The only connection to the outside world was a single dirt road that was often buried under layers of snow. Like the earth itself was trying to hide the village from prying eyes. That winter, the storms were particularly brutal. The winds howled through the forests like a beast on a hunt. And the snow, God, the snow piled up in drifts higher than the houses. The storm lasted for days, turning the world into a sheet of white, a blur of endless snowflakes that never seemed to stop. It didn't seem that strange at first. In Siberia, storms like that were part of the deal. People hunkered down, sealed themselves inside their homes, and waited for the weather to pass. But when we arrived, things were different. I remember the first sight of Yalovka. It was just as the storm was beginning to subside, the clouds breaking apart to reveal the oppressive gray sky. We thought we'd find a ghost town, maybe a few desperate souls huddled in their homes, waiting for rescue, but instead, what we found was far worse. The village was empty, not abandoned, not even a trace of the people who had lived there. The houses, the barns, the stables, they were all still standing, as though the villagers had simply walked away. Every window was shut tight, every door closed. No lights, no smoke curling from chimneys, just the eerie stillness that only a dead place can have. The village wasn't abandoned. It was as if the village had simply ceased to be. I still remember the knot in my stomach when I walked into the first house. There was no sign of a struggle, no overturned furniture. The beds were made, the table set for dinner, though the food was frozen solid. It was as though everyone had left in a hurry, but left no trace behind, no note, no reason, just an empty, frozen shell. We searched the entire village. There were no bodies, no signs of a struggle, no traces of violence, nothing. It was as if the villagers had been wiped from existence. We went door to door, knocking, shouting for anyone who might be inside. But there was no answer, no response, nothing but the dead silence of the snow. And then we found it. In the snow, just outside the village, we found a set of footprints. They were large, uneven steps, like someone had been walking in a hurry. The prints led out into the forest at the edge of the village, deep into the trees. But after a few hundred yards, they simply stopped, vanished. There was no sign of where the person had gone, no trace of them anywhere. Now, this is where the story gets strange. We followed those footprints, deeper and deeper into the forest. The snow was still thick, but something about the air had changed, felt heavy, oppressive, like the world was holding its breath. The silence was unbearable, and the forest seemed to close in on us, as though the trees were leaning in to listen. We walked for miles, and the deeper we went, the more the strange feeling of being watched crept over us. And then we saw it. The trees opened up into a clearing, and there, standing in the middle of it, was something I can't explain. At first, I thought it was a tree, just another twisted, gnarled branch stretching up to the sky. But then I realized that it was too perfect, too symmetrical, and when I stepped closer, I saw the patterns, the carvings, etched deep into the bark of the tree. Not just random marks, these were symbols I couldn't read, but I knew they weren't of human origin. And at the base of the tree, in the snow, was something else, something that made my blood freeze. The snow had been disturbed, as though something had been scraping at the ground. When I knelt down to look closer, I found the remnants of what could only be described as claw marks. Deep, long gouges in the snow, leading back toward the village. But there was nothing. No sign of anyone. No trace of what had left those marks. Just the heavy silence of the forest. The feeling of being watched. We made our way back to the village. But by then, the storm had returned. The wind howled louder, and the snow began to fall again, blurring our vision and covering our tracks. The rescue mission was called off. It was deemed too dangerous to continue, and we were forced to leave Yolovka behind. But we couldn't forget it. No one who was there that day could. To this day, I can't explain what happened to the people of Yolovka. Some say they were taken by a force older than man, that the forest itself claimed them. Others say that they ran, driven by fear of something they couldn't see, and that whatever was hunting them didn't let them go. There are some stories, though, that suggest a darker fate, one that doesn't involve a quick death or a clean disappearance. A fate that involves the slow, creeping horror of something watching, something waiting. A fate where the village isn't really gone. It's just waiting, waiting for someone to come back, waiting for the next person to make the wrong step. And to this day, no one dares venture near Yolovka. Not after what happened, not after what we saw, because, out there, in the snow, in the cold, something is still waiting, and it knows who's next. Story number 4. The strange disappearance on Mount Hood. There are places in the world where the mountains seem to hold secrets, where the land itself feels like it's watching you. Mount Hood, rising high in Oregon, is one of those places. I was a part of a group that decided to tackle it during the dead of winter, when the snow blanketed everything like a thick, oppressive veil. The kind of snow that doesn't just cover the earth, it consumes it. We were a group of 5, all experienced climbers. At least, we thought we were. In hindsight, I'm not sure any amount of experience could have prepared us for what happened up there, for what we lost, for the thing that took him. We had been planning the trip for months. Our packs were heavy with gear, our bodies tight with anticipation and nervous excitement. Mount Hood had always been a challenge, but it was nothing we hadn't conquered before, or so we thought. The weather was frigid when we arrived at the base, the mountain looming above us like a jagged sentinel. The skies were clear, the sun just beginning to dip behind the peak. It felt almost surreal. There was a kind of peace in the air, that odd quiet that settles over the land when snow starts to fall. But there was something else too, something unspoken. I didn't know it at the time, but we were being watched. The mountain, and whatever lies hidden in its frozen heart, was waiting for us. We spent the first day climbing, making good time, our hearts pumping in rhythm with the effort. As the sun set, the temperature dropped sharply, and we set up camp near a ledge, our tents tucked close together for warmth. The wind howled through the trees, but inside the tents, felt like a different world, warm and safe, sheltered from the unforgiving cold. That first night, as I lay trying to fall asleep, I heard something. It was faint, just a whisper against the wind, but it was there, a soft rustling, a murmur, like the mountain itself was sighing. I brushed it off as the wind playing tricks, but even as I tried to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was the kind of feeling you get when you're being watched, you know, deep down, that there's something in the shadows, something that shouldn't be there. The next day, we continued our ascent. It was a brutal climb, the snow deeper than we'd anticipated. But the mountain was beautiful, stark, majestic. We reached higher ground and found ourselves pushing through waist-deep drifts. The air grew thinner, colder, the winds more biting, but we pushed on. That was when Alex went missing. We'd been a tight-knit group, all close friends since college, and Alex was the kind of guy who always kept a cool head. But on that day, he was the one who lost it. 1 minute, he was in front of me, leading the way through the snow. The next minute, he was gone. I called out for him, my voice swallowed by the vast expanse of whiteness. My heart began to race, my breath coming in panicked gasps as I scanned the landscape for any sign of him. We all shouted his name, but there was no answer, only the eerie silence that echoed back to us. We backtracked, searching the snow-covered slopes for hours, until exhaustion began to gnaw at us. The snow was relentless, and the mountain itself seemed to mock our efforts. It wasn't until the afternoon, as the sun sank lower and the shadows lengthened, that we found something. A bag. It was lying in a small cave-like nook between two rocks. I would have missed it if I hadn't spotted the slight curve of a zipper in the snow. But that wasn't the strangest part. The bag wasn't just tossed carelessly in the snow. It was placed neatly, almost as if someone had set it down, taking great care to arrange it in that exact spot. We knelt down, hands trembling as we pulled open the bag. There was no sign of Alex inside, no clue to his whereabouts. But there was something else, something far worse. A sleeping bag, and it was set up perfectly, as though it had been laid out for someone to sleep in. But there was no person inside, no sign of struggle, no trace of Alex. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I stood there, staring at the empty bag. The air felt thick, like something was pressing down on us from all sides. I glanced around, but there was nothing but snow, white and endless, stretching out in every direction. It was as if Alex had never been there at all. I wanted to scream, to shout his name again, but something stopped me. Something in the back of my mind whispered that we were being watched. Watched by something that wasn't human, something that belonged to the mountain. The search continued through the night, but we found nothing. No trace of Alex, no other signs to follow. It was as if the mountain had swallowed him whole. The hours stretched on, and I began to lose track of time. My mind was foggy, my thoughts swirling in a haze of confusion and terror. We returned to the base camp the following morning, our spirits crushed under the weight of our failure. We filed a missing person report when we got back to civilization, but the search parties that followed came back empty-handed. There were no new leads, no clues, just the same empty wilderness, indifferent to the loss of one more soul. But that's not the worst part. No, the worst part is what happened after we came back home. What I started to see. I saw Alex. It wasn't the first time I'd thought I'd seen someone I knew after a traumatic event. But this, it was different. It was him, standing just outside my door, looking at me through the frosted window, his face pale and frozen, his eyes wide and empty. I could feel his gaze even before I saw him, cold and distant, like something not fully there. The longer I looked, the more I saw, the more I understood. It wasn't him. Not really. When I tried to open the door, he was gone. Over the next few weeks, I saw him again and again, always in the corner of my vision, standing just out of reach. Each time, I tried to approach him, to reach out, but it was always the same. The cold would crawl under my skin, the darkness would stretch out, and the figure of Alex would vanish into the shadows, leaving me with nothing but the feeling that he was still out there, somewhere. I know what you're thinking. It's just stress. It's just grief. But I swear to you, whatever it was that took Alex, it didn't just leave him up there on that mountain. Followed him back to us all. And it's still out there, waiting. The mountain doesn't forget. It never forgets. And neither will I. Story number 5. Winter camp in the Canadian wilderness. It was the kind of trip that seemed like a good idea at the time. A group of us, 6 students from the university, decided we needed a break from the books, a break from the stress of exams, a break from everything that seemed to weigh on our minds. So, we packed our bags, grabbed our gear, and headed into the Canadian wilderness for a winter camping trip we thought would be the perfect escape. You know the kind of escape I'm talking about. The kind where you imagine cozy nights around a fire, the crackle of wood, the crisp air filling your lungs as you wake up to a world of snow and silence. We were expecting that peace. What we got, though, was something much darker, something that wasn't supposed to be there. We set up camp in a remote part of the forest, a place far away from any towns, from any human civilization. It was just us, the snow, and the trees stretching high above us, their skeletal branches twisting against the gray sky. It was beautiful, in a way, but there was an unease about the place. It was as though the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. That night, we sat around the fire, talking and laughing, enjoying the warmth of the flames in contrast to the cold that seeped into our bones. We'd all been to the woods before, on trips with friends, on weekend hikes, but this place, this forest, it felt different. The air was thick, like something was pressing in from all sides, something unseen. Maybe it was just the isolation, or maybe the winter cold, but I remember feeling that something was wrong long before it actually happened. It started with a sound. At first, it was faint, just a rustle in the trees, a whisper of wind that we thought was the trees creaking. But as the night deepened, the sound grew louder. It wasn't wind. It wasn't the trees. It was something else. A soft thud, a shuffling. It came from the direction of the woods, beyond the firelight, where the darkness swallowed everything whole. I told myself it was an animal, a bear, maybe, or a deer wandering through the forest. We'd been warned to be cautious, to be aware of the wildlife, especially with the cold pushing animals toward shelter. But something about the sound wasn't right. It wasn't the random, haphazard sounds of animals. This was deliberate. It was too methodical. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with unease. I nodded slowly, my gaze shifting toward the dark line of trees. "Probably just an animal," I said, though even I didn't believe it. But Sarah didn't look convinced. None of us did. One of our group, Alex, was the first to get up. "I'll go check it out," he said, his voice trying too hard to sound brave. But we all knew he wasn't. He pulled on his boots and grabbed his flashlight. "Stay here. I'll be back in 5 minutes. Don't go too far," I warned him, but Alex was already walking away, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness as he ventured into the woods. We waited, the silence heavy around us, broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 15. The longer he was gone, the more that knot of unease twisted in my stomach. I got up, unable to sit still any longer. "I'll go find him," I said. No one argued. We all stood, our faces drawn, our eyes wide in the shadows. Sarah was clutching her coat, her breath shallow, her eyes flickering toward the trees, toward the places where the darkness seemed to be moving of its own accord. I followed the trail of footprints in the snow, my heart thudding in my chest. Alex's flashlight beam had long since vanished, and now there was nothing but the thickening shadows. The sound had stopped, but it hadn't gone away. It was still there, lingering just at the edge of hearing, like something or someone was out there, just beyond the trees, waiting. When I finally found him, he was standing in the clearing, just outside the tree line. His back was to me, his body rigid. I called his name, but he didn't respond. It was as if he hadn't heard me. I moved closer, my breath visible in the cold night air, my footsteps crunching on the snow. "Alex," I said again, this time louder. He turned slowly, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. His pupils were dilated, as though he were in a state of shock. And when he spoke, his voice was strange. Not his voice, not the Alex I knew. "They're coming," he whispered, his gaze darting to the dark woods behind me. "They're going to take us." "Who?" I asked, but I already knew the answer. I could see it in his face. The fear, the terror, the unmistakable feeling that something was stalking us, waiting for the right moment to strike. "The ones who never left," Alex murmured, his voice trembling. "The ones who walk in the dark. I saw them, out there, in the trees." I tried to shake it off, tried to tell myself he was just scared, that he'd imagined it. But there was something in the way he said it, something in his eyes that told me he wasn't making it up. Let's go back to camp, I said, trying to steady my voice. It's okay, Alex. Whatever you saw, it's gone now. But he didn't move. He just kept staring at the dark trees, his breath coming in quick. Shallow gasps. They're not gone, he said, almost in a whisper. They're still here. I can hear them. And then, as if to prove his point, I heard it too. A soft scraping sound, just beyond the trees. Slow, deliberate. Something was moving through the snow, circling us. My heart skipped a beat. I could feel the cold seep deeper into my bones, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I pulled Alex by the arm, trying to force him back toward camp. But he didn't resist. He was beyond that now. He was somewhere else, in a place I couldn't reach. When we got back to the fire, the others were waiting, their faces drawn with concern. But as soon as they saw Alex, they went pale. He wasn't himself anymore. Alex didn't speak again. He just stared into the fire, his eyes flickering like the flames. And he didn't blink. His lips moved occasionally, muttering things none of us could understand. But what he said made my skin crawl. He said things about shadows in the woods, about footsteps that followed you wherever you went, about eyes that watched you from the trees. We packed up immediately, the night now thick with a terror none of us could explain. The air felt heavy, suffocating. I don't know how we made it back to the truck, but somehow we did. We drove away in silence, the forest receding behind us, the dark shadows still lingering in our minds. None of us spoke much after that, and none of us ever spoke of the trip again. But sometimes, when the wind howls outside at night, when the darkness presses in from all sides, I can still hear those sounds, the soft scraping, the low murmurs in the trees, and I can't help but wonder if they're still out there, waiting for the next group of unsuspecting fools to wander into their domain, waiting for the next campfire to flicker out, for the next soul to be claimed. And maybe, just maybe, it's not the darkness we need to fear. Maybe it's the silence that comes before they arrive. Story number 6. The haunted house in Montana. You know, people think they know fear. They think they've encountered it. Maybe it's a bad car accident, or a near-death experience, or standing alone in the dark with your heart hammering in your chest. But none of that comes close to what fear feels like when it's cold. Cold in your bones, like the air in Montana winters. That's the kind of fear that creeps up on you in ways you can't prepare for. You can feel it, but you can't see it. And if you're unlucky, it comes to you in the most innocent of places, like a house. I didn't believe in ghosts before that winter. I didn't even think about them. But after everything happened, I think about them all the time. And that's the problem, isn't it? Once they get inside your head, they don't ever leave. The house was perfect, or so we thought. Old, yes, but we figured it had character. Character, they say, is what makes a place feel like home. The realtors didn't tell us about the house's history, not the parts they should have. They didn't tell us that it had been sitting empty for over a decade, not a soul living there, or that it was once home to a family that vanished one winter night. A family like ours, only they didn't make it out. But when you're young, you don't think about that stuff. You don't ask the questions you should. You just fall in love with the creaking floors, the tall, narrow windows, and the cozy fireplace. So when we packed our bags, I thought we were heading for a fresh start, a new life. I never suspected that Montana's winter would offer me something far worse. The first night we spent in the house was quiet. Too quiet. You know the kind of quiet I mean, the one where the stillness feels like a weight pressing on your chest? We didn't think much of it, though. We were tired from the move, trying to settle in. My wife, Jane, was already unpacking dishes in the kitchen, humming to herself. My 2 kids, Sam and Lily, were upstairs exploring the rooms. I was in the living room, fiddling with the old fireplace. The wind howled outside, the snow falling thick and fast, as it tends to in Montana during December. And then we heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound at first, like a faint scratching, a shuffle of footsteps, came from upstairs. Or maybe it was from behind the walls. It was hard to tell. "Did you hear that?" Jane called out, her voice tight with uncertainty. I paused, listening. But there was only the wind and the creak of the old house settling. "Probably just the house," I said, trying to sound confident. These old places have a way of making noise. But even as I said it, I could feel the unease creeping in. It wasn't just the sound, it was the way the silence returned afterward. Heavy and expectant, as though waiting for something. Presence. The next morning, we brushed it off. The kids were excited to be in their new rooms. I was busy cleaning up the mess from the move, and Jane was making a pot of coffee. But that afternoon, when I was cleaning out the closet in the hallway, I noticed something strange. There was a door. Now, I know what you're thinking. Of course, there was a door. But this wasn't a door that we had seen before. It was old, worn, and it was tucked away behind a stack of boxes that hadn't been there the night before. We had walked through that hallway the evening before, and I was sure we hadn't missed it. I called Jane over. "Look at this," I said. "Where did this door come from?" She looked at it, squinting, as though trying to remember. "I don't know. It wasn't there last night." We stood there, both of us staring at the door, a sense of unease creeping up on us. It was made of weathered wood, the kind of wood that had aged over time, its surface cracked and scarred by years of neglect. The doorknob was old-fashioned, brass, and a little tarnished. Without thinking, I reached out and turned the knob. The door creaked open slowly, like it was waking from a long slumber. Beyond it was a small room, hidden, forgotten, locked away for God knows how long. It was a dusty, narrow space, dimly lit by the faint light filtering through a small, grimy window. But what really caught my attention were the markings on the floor, the unmistakable impressions of old, faded footprints, like someone had been walking in circles for hours. And there, in the corner, was an old wooden rocking chair, the kind of chair you would find in a grandmother's house. Worn smooth from years of use, it was facing the corner, and it was rocking. I didn't know what to say. I could feel Jane's eyes on me, her voice barely a whisper as she asked, "Who would leave a room like this? Why would they hide it?" I couldn't answer her. The room felt wrong, like it was waiting for something, or someone. That night, the whispers started. It began as a faint murmur, a low hum, like distant voices carried on the wind. At first, I thought it was the sound of the wind outside, or maybe the house settling again. But the voices were too clear, too human. They were speaking words I couldn't understand, their tones soft but insistent. We all heard it. Sam and Lily came running into our bedroom, wide-eyed and frantic. "Mom! Dad!" Sam's voice shook as he spoke. "There's someone in the room across the hall. They're talking. We heard it through the walls." I looked at Jane. Her face was pale, her lips tight with fear. I could tell she didn't want to believe it. I didn't either. But I knew something was wrong. We had all felt it, the unease, the creeping sensation that something was in the house with us, watching us. That night, I locked the door to the secret room. I don't know why. Maybe I thought that would keep whatever it was inside that room. Maybe I thought if I ignored it, it would go away. But the next night, the whispers came again. Only this time, they weren't coming from the walls. They were coming from behind the door to the secret room. "Let us in. Let us in." They whispered, over and over, in the same rhythmic chant. I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to see what was behind that door. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob, turning it slowly, almost afraid of what I would find. When the door opened, the room was still, silent except for the chair, the rocking chair. It was moving, slowly rocking back and forth, as if someone invisible was sitting in it, their feet brushing against the floor with each movement. But there was no one there. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at that empty chair, the whispers growing louder, closer, until they were almost deafening. And then, like a sudden burst of cold wind, I slammed the door shut. We left the house the next day, I couldn't take it anymore. Jane didn't argue. She was already packing, her hands shaking, her face pale. The kids didn't ask questions. They didn't need to. As we drove away from that house, I looked back in the rearview mirror. The house was dark, empty, but for a split second, I swear I saw something in the window, a shadow, a figure standing behind the glass, watching us leave. I don't know if the house is still standing. I don't care to know, but I'll never forget the whispers, the rocking chair, the feeling of something or someone waiting in the dark. The house in Montana was never meant to be a home. It was a prison, a tomb, and we were just unlucky enough to walk into it. I don't think I'll ever be able to shake the feeling that something followed us. Something still watches me. Every night, when I close my eyes, I hear those whispers, faint but still there, calling out to me from the dark. And now, every winter, when the snow begins to fall, I can't help but look over my shoulder, half expecting to see that house again, waiting for us. Story number 7. The strange bus ride in Alaska. I've never told this story before, not in full. Anyway, I've tried to forget it, tried to block it from my mind. But there's something about that night that clings to me, like a shadow that never lets go. If I close my eyes, I can still hear the soft hum of the bus engine, the sound of the snow crunching beneath the tires, the eerie quiet of the Alaska wilderness stretching out for miles in every direction. It was supposed to be a simple, uneventful ride, just another winter night in a town where not much ever happens. But that's the thing about Alaska. Even in the quiet, there are things out there, things that should never be known. I was in my late 20s when it happened. My name is Jack, though I don't use it much anymore. Most people just call me the man who made it out. I guess that's as close to a title as I'll ever get. You see, I wasn't alone on that bus. There were 7 of us, all strangers to one another, all headed somewhere on that long, snow-covered road. But by the end of the night, none of us would ever be the same. It was late December. The snow was thick, and the temperatures had dropped so low that even the air seemed to freeze. I don't know how familiar you are with Alaska's winters, but it's not like anything you can imagine unless you've lived through it. The cold isn't just cold. It's something deeper, something ancient. The land itself seems frozen, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I was boarding the bus at midnight in a small, almost forgotten village, the kind of place where no one bothers to look for you if you go missing. The driver was an older man, a guy by the name of Walt. He didn't say much. His face was etched with years of hard living, and his eyes had that distant, worn look of someone who had seen more than they ever wanted to. But that's normal out here. People come to Alaska for many reasons, but none of them are the kind that make you feel better about the world. The bus ride was supposed to take about 3 hours. We were headed to a larger town, one of the few that could still be accessed through the snow-heavy roads. The others on the bus, 3 women, 2 men, and a couple sat quietly. None of us spoke much at first. There's an unspoken understanding among people who travel at night in places like this. Keep your head down. Don't draw attention. And don't ask too many questions. But the silence didn't feel right. Felt heavy, like something was waiting. The road wound through desolate stretches of wilderness, trees thick with snow, dark mountains looming in the distance, and no sign of life. Not a single house. Nothing. Felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something, just like the land. I tried to settle back in my seat, but the unease gnawed at me, a strange feeling, like someone was watching. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing up. I thought it was just the cold, but I couldn't shake the feeling. Then, without any warning, the bus came to a sudden stop. At first, I thought it was just a rough patch in the road. But the silence that followed felt wrong, unnaturally wrong. The bus idled in place, and I could see the headlights slicing through the swirling snow. But there was no sound, no wind, no crunch of snow, nothing. It was as if the world outside had disappeared. Walt, the driver, sat frozen in his seat, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white. "Walt?" One of the passengers called out, her voice breaking the stillness. "What's going on?" There was no answer. The older man sat there, staring ahead. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I could tell something was wrong. His expression was frozen, like he was locked in place, as if time had stopped for him. I don't know how much time passed before one of the men, Gary, I think his name was, stood up and walked toward the front of the bus. "Walt, hey, you all right?" Gary asked, tapping the driver's shoulder. Walt didn't move. Gary turned to us, his face pale. "I think we should get off the bus. Something's wrong with him." We all stood up, uneasy, but no one said anything. It wasn't normal for a bus driver to go silent like that, especially in the middle of nowhere. We all piled off the bus, huddling together in the snow, our breaths coming out in white clouds. I remember the feeling of the cold air hitting my face, but it wasn't just the cold that made my skin crawl. It was the emptiness, the absolute silence that hung in the air. The snow was still falling, but the world felt dead. No sound, no movement. It was as if we had entered some kind of void. We tried the door of the bus, but it was locked tight. We knocked on the windows, but there was no response from Walt. We couldn't even see him through the fogged glass. I don't know how long we stood there, feeling the frost seeping into our bones. Eventually, we decided to walk down the road, back the way we had come, hoping to find some sign of life. But the road was just as desolate as it had been before. No houses, no lights, nothing. After what seemed like an eternity, we turned around and headed back to the bus. We weren't sure what else to do. The snow had begun to fall harder, the wind picking up, and the world had turned into a white blur. But when we reached the bus, something else had changed. The windows, which had been open before we left, were now completely shut tight, locked, as if someone had come by and closed them while we were gone. Panic began to set in then. No one spoke. No one even dared to speak. We all climbed back onto the bus, one by one, feeling the fear grow in our chests. I remember hearing the others murmuring, their voices barely audible over the howling wind. The feeling of being watched, the same sensation I had before, had grown tenfold. But this time, it wasn't just me. The others felt it too. We all sat down, the seats now seeming like prisons. No one dared to speak. There was no sound but the humming of the engine, which had started up again without any explanation. But it wasn't Walt who had turned the key. I saw that much when I glanced up at the rearview mirror. It was empty, completely empty. And then the door slid open. It happened so quickly, I almost didn't have time to process it. One moment, the door was shut, and the next, it was wide open. A blast of cold air rushed into the cabin, the snow swirling around us. We could all feel it, the temperature dropping even more. The air thick with something that didn't belong. Something had gotten on the bus with us. We didn't see it, not at first, but we felt it. There was something there, in the space between us, something cold and invisible but undeniable. The door slammed shut again, and we all jumped. It wasn't a gust of wind that slammed it. It was a force, something unseen but felt by all of us. Presence. And that's when we realized Walt was gone, completely gone. We were alone now, stuck in the middle of nowhere, with no idea how to get out. The rest of the ride was a blur. Or maybe it was just that my mind couldn't process what happened next. All I know is that when I finally arrived at the next town, I was the only one who stepped off the bus. The others, there were no signs of them. No traces. Nothing. No one ever spoke about it again. The bus disappeared. Walt vanished without a trace. And no one in that town seemed to remember that bus ride. That night, as if it had been erased from history. But I remember everything, and I've never taken another bus ride in Alaska since. Because there are things out there, things that follow you when you least expect it, and they don't care if you're ready for them or not. Some doors, once opened, should never be closed.